My days as one of the top airmen at George Air Force Base in Southern California. Well, maybe I wasn't one of the top airmen. Well, I'll tell you about that later. I left Terre Haute, Indiana for George Air Force Base in the summer of 1967. I arrived at George Air Force Base with my new haircut, my new suit, and a duffel bag on my back, and found out that I would be living in Barracks 1, room number 1, with this guy, who was sitting out on the steps in front of my new home. Well, inside I found out where I'd be living for the next several months anyway. Don Zollinger was my first roommate. Don was this nice guy from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Told me everything about the base that I needed to know that first night I was there. My bunk was that one up there. As I lay up in my bunk that night, getting over that long day that I had getting to California, in came my second roommate, Rich Talent. Now, Rich wasn't quite as nice as Don was. Rich threw his coat on the ground and said, "Who the hell is that?" And he screamed at Don, "Just as we get this room together, they send us another Jeep." A Jeep was a new recruit at George, I guess that's what they called us back then. Well, Don said, "Hey, he's a nice guy. He's from Indiana, and he's got a car." Rich took one look at me and said, "You got a car? No shit?" Well, that made things okay with Rich. And the next day I found out where I'd be working. It was Warehouse 1 in the 479th Supply Squadron. Here was my first civilian boss. Told me that I'd be carrying a lot of boxes, putting them on this conveyor belt. They'd go down to receiving on the end, and out on the flight line to be put onto F4s. While I was sending boxes of airplane parts out to the flight line, my grandparents back in Terre Haute, Indiana, got in my 1965 Chevrolet and drove my car out to George Air Force Base. And of course, when they got here, I had to take them down to LA to see all the tourist attractions: Disneyland, Universal Studios, the Wax Museum, Hollywood Wax Museum. That was right next to Grumman's Chinese Theater. When you go in the Wax Museum, they have a sign that says, "Do not cross over ropes to get near the wax figures." But I never did obey rules very well. Here I am with Sean Connery, and this is me and the former President Dwight David Eisenhower. He's a nice guy. He didn't say much, though. But for the next one, I needed my grandmother's wig and her white sweater in order to pose with The Last Supper. After a week, my grandparents flew back to Indiana, and I had my guitar, so I was entertaining the troops. Now that I had my car, I made a lot of friends, and we went places like Palm Springs and Death Valley, of all places. We even went to Barstow. Who wanted to go to Barstow? But that's what we did, and I became kind of a taxi cab driver, so I got to know a lot of the guys. Windy days, they'd jump in the car, and I'd drive to work with a carload of airmen. It wasn't long, I had to go to the rifle range to shoot the M16. You have 70 rounds, and you shoot from 3 different positions: standing, kneeling, and on your stomach. At the end, when I turned my target in, I barely qualified. But the guys on each side of me had over 70 holes in their targets. So I guess it was a pretty good shot. I hit 3 targets. Of course, I didn't qualify for a marksmanship ribbon, but all you had to do was go to the BX and buy one. So I got my marksmanship ribbon to go along with my Vietnam participation ribbon. Well, Christmas time came up, and I found out why my roommate Rich was so excited about me having a car. He lived in San Leandro, California, which was about 500 miles above Southern California, but it was really nice to spend time with someone on my first Christmas away from Indiana in my life, although they don't look so excited about seeing me, do they? Well, after the new year, and we brought in 1968, it was a few months, and Rich got his orders. He was shipped overseas to Thailand. About that same time, Don Zollinger was planning on a trip back to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania to marry the love of his life, Linda. After their wedding, they spent their honeymoon traveling across the country. He even stopped in my hometown of Terre Haute, Indiana, and was entertained by my parents. There's my mom. When they returned to Southern California, they got an apartment in Victorville. And I had the barracks to myself. So I made it look more like a dorm room in a college than a barracks. Took the bunk bed off and gave it to my new roommates. My new roommates were Benny Munguia from Texas. There's John Muir from Washington State. And Nolan Powell from Alabama. And at my duty assignment at Warehouse 1, I got a promotion out of the warehouse and into an office. It was then I met the base chaplain, and he invited me to sing at church. That led to being in the base talent contest, which I was lucky enough to win, to which I was sent to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio for the TAC talent contest. I didn't win the TAC talent contest, but it was an honor to represent George Air Force Base in that event. Well, now that I was so well known on the base, well, at least to the people that saw my picture in the base paper that week, I was invited to do a morning radio show on KAVR radio in Roy Rogers' Apple Valley Inn. The host of that show was Fanny Dunnicliff, and she introduced me to the high desert.
I'd like to introduce a very special guest this morning. He's a young airman from George Air Force Base, Randy Andrews.
And I sang with my old friend Terry Kurtz, a DJ at KAVR at the time, called A Song from the Kaleidoscope of Contemporary Music.
Love is lovelier the second time around, just as wonderful with both feet on the ground.
Over the next year, I was on Fanny's show probably about a half a dozen times. And I got to meet Roy Rogers. They even covered it in my Terre Haute paper back in Indiana, my hometown. They said I was on a TV show. They got that wrong, but I got to meet Roy Rogers. Then I did a show with his wife, Dale Evans. After the show, we were having breakfast, and I noticed that Dale Evans was cutting her bacon with a knife and fork. So I tried that. Half of my bacon flew out of my plate onto the center of the table. I looked at her, she didn't look at me. I don't know if she noticed or not. From that moment on, I continued to eat bacon with my fingers. The next celebrity I appeared with on her show was, horse is a horse, of course, and no one can talk to a horse, of course. That is, of course, unless the horse is the famous Mr. Ed. I remember having a lot more breath than that. Not only Mr. Ed, but I got to meet and work with, I appeared in the show with him, Marvin Miller, the millionaire. He gave $1 million away every week in the 50s and 60s. Gave me $1 million check for good luck. I met this lady, Marilyn Turman, on Fanny's program. She was a talented keyboard player and singer. So together, we decided to put together a band. We soon found this guy, another airman, Rick Shaviers from Wichita Falls, Texas. Together, we played around the valley for a few months and then landed a permanent gig at the Red Log in downtown Victorville. We changed the name to Randy Andrew and Friends, and with different musicians, I stayed working there 5 nights a week for the next year and a half. And of course, being a rock star like I was, I had to have my hair a little bit longer than everybody else. I also had to keep it covered 5 or 6 days when I worked at the base. Here's how I did it. I'd wash my hair in the morning, put mousse on it, spray it with hairspray, plaster it back as best I can, and go off to work. One Halloween, I got a wig like this to take to work and have some fun with it. It was fun until my sergeant got a look at it when I was wearing it. I tried to take it off. He said, "Leave it on and follow me." He marched me down to Colonel Carl Floto's office where they were having an officers' meeting and stood me in the center of the room. After being uncomfortable and standing there for a little while they laughed, I took the wig off and my actual hair fell out over my ears. Colonel Floto put one leg up and put his hands over his face and said, "Put the wig back on." 14 years later, my wife Linda and I were doing a radio show on that same KABR station that I used to sing at. It was a talk show, and we took calls from the audience. One day I told my Air Force story about wearing the wig to work, and we had a few calls about Halloween and fun, and guess who called? Colonel Carl Floto. All he said was, "Airman Andrew, get a haircut." It indeed was Carl Floto, retired U.S. Air Force, living in Apple Valley, and a fan of our show. He used to listen to it, so you never know who's out there listening. Now let's go back to 1971 and my last few days as an airman at George Air Force Base. Again, it was the hair thing. I went to sign out at the headquarters. The staff sergeant behind the desk said, "Airman, you're not signing out until you get a military haircut just like mine." All I had left was a few more minutes in the Air Force, and I wasn't going to get a haircut. No way. I thought about it for a while, and I decided to ask my friend Dennis Wilson if he'd do me a favor. Dennis Wilson was my last roommate in the barracks, and I asked him if he would sign me out. He looked enough like me, so I think we can pull it off, and he agreed. My friend Dennis Wilson signed me out of the Air Force. So I often thought, am I AWOL, or does the government owe me a lot of back pay? Dennis stayed in the Air Force and made it his career and retired to his home state of Florida. I still keep in touch with him via Facebook. He's probably the only person in the Air Force that signed out discharge papers on 2 different people. 10 years after my discharge, I was named Honorary Mayor of Apple Valley, and one of my duties as mayor was to attend the Airman of the Month banquet and present a certificate of appreciation from the town of Apple Valley. While attending an air show at George, I met the base commander, General Richard Myers. He invited me and Linda to the base for lunch at the Officers Club and took me on a tour of the base. What was really cool, when I drove up to the gate and the guard asked me what my business was, I said, "I'm Randy Andrew and I'm here to see General Myers." He checked his papers, stood at attention, saluted me, and said, "Mayor Andrew, please park over here. The general will be with you soon." What a kick that was. General Myers and his wife became friends of mine, and they used to come to the Apple Valley Inn to watch me perform. And when the general received his 2nd star, he became Brigadier General and had to move on to a bit larger base. He invited me to speak at his going-away party, and that was the last time I ever set foot on George Air Force Base. I still keep in touch with Don and Linda Zollinger in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. They even came out here to visit us a couple of times. Richard Talent now lives in Oregon. Ken Grubbs now lives in his home state of Virginia, and he too has been out here for a visit or two. Another 2 old Air Force buddies, Gene Sherratt and John Jennings, surprised me one day, stopping by on the way from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. Well, we had an old barbecue and talked about old times at the base and remembered a parade about 30 years earlier. Gene and I were living in Las Vegas in the late 1980s, and when Gene found out that I was going to be the Grand Marshal of the Apple Valley Days Parade, he offered to bring his 1929 Auburn boat-tail Speedster all the way to Apple Valley for me to ride in the parade. That year, they announced that George Air Force Base would be closing. The gate today is still open 30 years after the closing of the base. As you see, it still stands, but it's a ghost town. The authorities explained that the airplane fuel that spilled over this area for many years that George Air Force Base was in operation contaminated the water and the ground and made it impossible for anybody to live there. That's why they never tried to use it again. The movie theater, 35 cents to get in. I think it was 15 cents for a bag of popcorn and a dime for a Coke. I remember seeing Charlton Heston and Planet of the Apes in that theater, among many others during my time at George. The base hospital really takes the cake. They rebuilt the base hospital, state of the art, 2 years before they announced that the base was going to close. Today, this is what the base hospital looks like. Can you imagine taking leave one day and go to this place to have a doctor look at you? Wow. Well, folks, this was my story, and I'm sticking to it. My story of my days at George Air Force Base.